Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of Napoleon Bonaparte, right? The Napoleonic phase of the French Revolution and the growth of the First French Empire, right? That is actually the phase that we're in right now, right? We are currently in or talking about or discussing the First French Empire, right? We talked about the French monarchy under Louis XVI. We talked about during the Revolution, they're going to go to the First French Republic, which is, of course, going to end with Louis XVI's head off his shoulders, which is a really, really gruesome kind of thing and stuff like that. But guillotines are fun. We'll talk about those a little bit more often as well. So going into it, though, we are now talking about the First French Empire, which is actually going to be formally created in 1804 when Napoleon is crowned emperor, right? Now, he's going to then go off, of course, and wage his Napoleonic Wars, right? And, whoa, before I get ahead of myself, let's talk about schedule. All right, so now, I know this is a little bit annoying for us to be sitting here talking about Napoleon on a flip and stuff like that during a virtual assignment because we're going to be virtual again today. But look, you're at your own house. You can watch this 100 times if you need to. And the big thing about it is if you have any questions, go ahead and write them down on sticky notes, slap them into your notes, and just make sure that you actually complete your warm-up and then the kind of like check-up questions at the end of the flip. And then also know that there's going to be homework. There'll be a homework flip, but it'll only be about like 10 minutes, right? And we're going to try and keep this flip kind of short because look how much we have to cover. Just that little bit right there, right? A little bit of stuff just to kind of wrap up Napoleon completely, and then move on into post-Napoleonic Europe, which is going to be a really, really big transition and a really, really big moment in European history, right? But the thing we left off on talking about Napoleon, though, right? We left off talking about Napoleon with his growth of his empire, right? We talked about the Battle of Trafalgar and the Battle of Austerlitz being really, really great examples of military battles that will actually demonstrate why we're going to have a nice big red outline around all this stuff and why there's not one around the Kingdom of Great Britain, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is the Battle of Trafalgar demonstrated his naval inability to actually storm into Great Britain or to measure up to the British Navy. And also we're going to see the Battle of Austerlitz be a really, really great example of his attempts and abilities to be able to fight on land using shock troops and dramatic charges and like big, quick lightning strikes with overwhelming force, right? And he's going to be able to use those military tactics to take over everything you see right here outlined in red. And theoretically speaking, also Russia, okay? He actually turns them kind of into a puppet state or an ally or browbeats them basically into being an ally underneath their king at the time, Tsar Alexander I, right? Now, going into it, though, we need to understand what's going to happen that's going to lead us from having basically a French Empire right here, which you've got the Duchy of Warsaw controlled by France. No more Holy Roman Empire. That's really, really big as well. Now this thing called the Confederation of the Rhine, and all of this different stuff controlled by the French, right? We talked about those two major battles, and we also talked about the major effects of the Napoleonic Wars, right? We talked about the spread of revolutionary ideas. That's kind of common sense. We talked about the destruction of the Holy Roman Empire. When he goes in there and takes it over, he then liquidates it down, takes some of that Western territorial land, gives it back to France, and then creates this thing called the Confederation of the Rhine, right? Now, that instance or that thing is going to help lead to this thing known as the Franco-German rivalry, where actually French people and German people are going to, nationalistically speaking, really dislike each other, right? Now, we're going to talk about that a little bit more later on and discuss how basically the Germans felt more German than they ever had in their entire existence when French soldiers were placed in their lands as occupational forces, and those French soldiers wanted to speak French, and they wanted French foods and French things, and it's going to make Germans feel very different from the French, and it's going to inspire this thing called nationalism, right? We talked about that at the end of the last flip, right? Now, it's also going to lead to the creation of nation-states, because within Napoleon's fall in 1815 to about only 50 years later, you're going to see the growth of places like Italy, which is going to become a completely new country all its own, and then also Germany, which is going to become a new country all its own, which is going to be a really, really big deal, okay? Now, going into it, though, we need to understand as well that Napoleon is going to have three massive mistakes, though, that are going to lead him from having a massive empire to crumbling and collapsing like a souffle if you talk too loudly, right? Now, going into it, though, we have to understand that it's going to be this thing known as the Continental System, and the violations of that system will then lead to the Peninsular War, which is an aggressive invasion of Spain and Portugal, if you want to write that down underneath of it, like a little just kind of like addendum, right? And then we've got his invasion of Russia for actually violating the Continental System that he sets up as well. These mistakes are going to be things that you have to understand as well, are going to be seen in the fracturing relationship of Napoleon and Talleyrand, right? So Charles Talleyrand was heavily against this idea of the Continental System. He was heavily against the idea of invading Spain for violating it. And he was heavily against the invasion of Russia. And apparently Napoleon yelled at him about these discouraging factors and yelled at him for actually going against his royal authority at the time as the new emperor of France. And he said that Charles Talleyrand is nothing but poop in a silk stocking, right? Like, that's really mean, Napoleon. But the thing that we need to understand, though, is those mistakes is going to take Napoleon from this moment where he's, of course, up late at night writing the Napoleonic Code and clutching a saber and trying to be all dramatic and really intense, to Grace, prepare yourself to laugh, to looking like this. So, yeah, of course, like looking like that, being sad and depressed, and the crumbling of his empire falling in front of him, right? Now, we need to understand, though, that there's going to be, like, what are these things that's going to actually lead to his downfall? What is the Continental System? Why did he have a Peninsular War? What peninsula are we talking about? And what was that big deal about that invasion of Russia? And also, why did this guy get exiled not once, but twice, all right? So, like, now, going into it, though, we need to understand that the Continental System is going to be a really big place that we need to start, okay? So Napoleon created this thing known as the Continental System, okay? And what the Continental System was is following his creation of the First French Empire and that taking over of Prussia and like also Austria and bringing them into this really, really large conglomerated force, browbeating them into being forced allies and stuff like that. Napoleon knew that he was never going to be able to militarily take over Great Britain directly. So he wants to attack their wallet yet again. Much like with the invasion of Egypt, that was a massive failure. This system will also, spoiler alert, be a massive failure as well. The thing that we need to understand about the Continental System is, what is it, right? Well, the Continental System was an attempt of Napoleon to try and blockade the entirety of Europe, right? And Britain, to prevent them from trading with the rest of Europe, right? So something that's going on in the background of all of this stuff that y'all don't really quite know a lot about yet, that we'll actually talk about in the next unit, in Unit 6, we'll be discussing the Industrial Revolution. The British are actually going through the Industrial Revolution, and they're creating all of these devices, factories, and the creation of steam-powered factories is actually on the rise as well by the 1800s. And so they're producing a large amount of processed and manufactured goods that the entirety of Europe has never seen before. And they're doing it cheaply. So they have all of these products, and the Europeans want them. And also, if you look at surface level beneath it, Britain has always supplied a lot of different areas, like Russia, with certain goods that they need throughout the year, right? So going into it, though, Napoleon pulls a fast one and says, no more trading with Great Britain. I don't care who you are. If you are an ally of France, you will not trade with them whatsoever, and we're going to set up a blockade to prevent it. Well, a couple of nations are going to ignore it, right? Like Alexander VI being the biggest one, of course, from Russia, who is going to violate the Continental System directly and really make Napoleon very, very upset. We need to understand, though, he violates this, though, also because it was kind of a bad system in the first place. Like, Napoleon wanted to set up this naval blockade, but following the Battle of Trafalgar and losing most of his navy, he didn't have enough boats to even set it up. So there was literally like holes all over it, right? You could just like sail right through, and you could just get to Russia and trade with them if you wanted to, if you're Britain, right? Like, so like literally they're going to ignore it. And Portugal and Russia are the biggest violators, right? Now, if you're Napoleon, what must you now do to try and actually enforce your Continental System is you must make an example out of these two groups, right? So first and foremost, let's talk about his first military action known as the Peninsular War, right? When Portugal and Spain violated this Continental System, what Napoleon decides to do is aggressively attack Portugal for ignoring the Continental System completely. Now, the thing that's going to end up going down that you need to really understand, though, is to get to Portugal, if you're a Napoleonic army, you must first go through Spain, right? Well, on their journey through Spain to get to Portugal, what is going to happen is Napoleon's forces are going to be aggressively attacked by guerrilla troops in Spain, right? Now, guerrilla, of course, being spelled G-U-E-R, right, not G-O-R, is a very, very, very important style of warfare that kind of demonstrates to us that, you know, people like the British and then also these other armies and stuff like that really can't fight guerrilla-style warfare because it kind of just violates their ability to actually fight this kind of stand across a field from each other and shoot volley fires at each other and then charge, right? Guerrilla warfare techniques are sporadic attacks on things like supply lines or troop movements. You're jumping out of bushes, you're hopping down from trees, you're coming out from behind buildings, and you're shooting and running away, right? Now, these attacks, though, caused massive loss of life for Napoleon's troops, and it also caused a massively expensive war, right? So Spain is going to use these guerrilla warfare techniques to actually inflict massive casualties on the French military, and Napoleon is never able to even get to Portugal to punish them effectively, right? And so this is going to be a massive failure for him, and it's going to gobble up a ton of his money, and it's a ton of his time, and also a very large chunk of his military, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go, and stuff like that. But the other big one that you need to know is the invasion of Russia. Now, out of the two, the Peninsular War and the invasion of Russia, the invasion of Russia is the bigger one, right? And it actually goes down in 1812, right? Now, in 1812, Napoleon is going to decide to invade Russia for trading with Great Britain. For violating that Continental System, he feels that Alexander I, the Tsar of Russia needs to be slapped on the wrist and be like, you are bad. Don't do that ever again, right? So what's going to end up going down, though, is he's going to decide to have a massive land invasion of Russia and go all the way through what is also known by this point as the Duchy of Warsaw, or Poland, basically, right? Now, that's another real big reason. If you really want to get into it, you can really look into a couple of videos that I actually attached in the description down below. If you want to learn a little bit more about the invasion of Russia and what went down, you can go ahead and check those out as well, right? Now, the thing that you need to understand, though, is that what are you barking about? I know, the invasion of Russia is a big deal. Now, look, the biggest thing, though, is that Napoleon is going to invade Russia, mostly because Russia, first of all, like, just goes against everything Napoleon... Pierre, stop. Because Napoleon actually just doesn't get along with Russia, right? Russia represents old imperial ideas. Russia hates the fact that Poland exists, because Poland didn't exist, because remember, they chopped it up during the French Revolution with Austria and Prussia. But the other thing about it as well that's going to go down is Napoleon is going to choose to attack Russia to try and make an example out of them. And also, he just thinks he's going to win, right? So going into it, he assembles a very, very large army, right? A huge army, probably the biggest that Europe has seen since the Roman Empire. And he refers to it as his Grand Army, and it's 600,000 troops. Well, the core of those troops are made up of trained French military, like soldiers. There are other ones that have been added too from Prussia and Austria and other areas that he's taken over, right? So right now, when you're looking at this Grand Army, you're talking about everybody that he controls has contributed young men to this fighting force, right? And Napoleon thinks that he's going to run in there with a 600,000 strong army, wipe out the Russian military, which is only about 120,000 at the time. And he also thinks he's going to do it using this newfangled concept called like tin can food, right? Which is a really exciting thing. And we'll talk about how that backfired on him a little bit later on, but we'll talk about that a little bit in class, because I could spend all day on a flip talking about how tin cans are going to really be a big bite in the butt to Napoleon, right? Well, what's going to go down, though, is he, of course, like goes off to Russia with that tin can food, has this massive army, and it takes him over a year to get there and then actually attack them. But when he starts engaging with Russian troops in the western reaches of Russia, what is now modern-day Belarus, the thing that ends up happening, though, is that the Russians would engage him, right? They would show up, they would engage him in a small battle, and then the Russians would retreat, right? Now, they would retreat further and further into Russia, all right? Now, as they went, this is something I need you to highlight right here, emblazon it into your memory, all right? As the Russians ran away in retreat, they would literally set everything on fire, right? Like I said, they would set all of it on fire. They would set farms on fire, villages, fields, all of these different items and all of these different things, right? To make it so Napoleon's troops couldn't use them. All the while luring them further and further and further into Russia as the year is going on and as the winter is beginning to set in, right? This left nothing for the French military to eat. It left nothing for the actual, like, usage of Napoleon's troops to actually, like, pillage, loot, and take things, which is a construct of Napoleonic warfare. What's it called? What is the word I'm looking for? This tactic is known as scorched earth policy, right? It's literally burning things as you retreat. Now, that is going to be a really big thing that's going to lead to a downfall of Napoleon's troops, because literally they can't use anything. And also, as the winter sets in, turns out tin cans tend to disintegrate when they're actually beneath a certain temperature for too long, and it actually ends up ruining the food that Napoleon brought with him. And so his troops are beginning to starve. They got all the way to Moscow, y'all. All the way to Moscow by 1813, and he never got a surrender from the Russian Tsar whatsoever, right? He got all the way to Moscow, and by the way, by the time he got to Moscow, it was on fire. So Moscow was set ablaze by Russian soldiers and was literally burning in front of Napoleon's eyes when he got there, right? And so the thing about it, though, is why is Moscow on fire? Because the Russians are saying to themselves, you won't use it, and we would rather burn it to the ground ourselves than have you use our stuff, right? And so Napoleon is going to then start retreating back to France during the winter. 590,000 of his 600,000 Grand Army troops starved or froze to death, right? Not shot by a Russian, starved or froze to death, right? You're talking about 90% of his military died from the elements from a tragic miscalculation by Napoleon, thinking he'd go in there and beat the Russians when they used scorched earth against him, and they lured him in during the winter. Now, we are starting to see why Talleyrand might have been right? Now, going into it, though, you're going to need to understand what actually ends up happening. So going into his next, for his warmongering and stuff like that, as his military retreats back and ends up back in France by 1813, over the next year, what's going to end up going down is the other people that he took over, Prussia, Austria, Russia, other entities like that, the Dutch, the British, are going to assemble a new coalition force, and they're going to attack Napoleon whilst he is at his weakest, right? They're like, how dare you take our sons off on that invasion of Russia? How dare you let them die and freeze to death? And they go after him, they beat him in battle, and they have him arrested. And at the end of the War of the Seventh Coalition, what is going to happen is Napoleon is arrested, and what the groups decide to do at this thing called the Congress of Vienna is they decide to exile him off the continent, right? So they exile him to this small island called Elba off the coast of Italy. Now, that is where Elba is located, right there, right off the coast of Italy, about like 90 miles away from what is now modern-day Genoa, right? Now, the funny thing about that is, I don't know if some of y'all were looking at that map right there, but on a bad day, I could probably doggy paddle from like Elba back to Italy, right? He's not really that far away whatsoever. Also, by the way, his mom went with him as well. And there was a treaty that Napoleon signed that he agreed to when he actually agreed to go into exile that he felt that they just really weren't holding up to, right? So Napoleon felt as though that the ideas of this treaty were not actually being held up to, so he actually decides to escape, right? And in 1815, Napoleon escapes Elba. And very, very casually just goes to a boat and he just like sails off, right? And he tells his mom before he goes, and he's like, Mom, do you think I can do it? And she's like, I think you can do it. I believe in you, buddy. So he literally goes back to Europe in 1815, less than a year after he's been in Elba, and he tries to retake the French Empire and create a new army, and he goes off and fights the coalition forces yet again, right? And at this big battle, it's going to be known as the Battle of Waterloo. And this moment in time is called the 100 Days, right? Because it's the 100 days of time where Napoleon went back to Europe after his exile, and he actually is going to try to retake his empire in that 100 days. And at the Battle of Waterloo, he's going to meet up against coalition forces yet again, led by, of course, famously, this guy known as the Duke of Wellington, right? And the Duke of Wellington, being a young, charismatic military leader, is going to meet him at Waterloo, which is in Belgium, right? And in Belgium, in Waterloo, Napoleon makes a series of really bad military mistakes. Like, for example, he leads a cavalry charge over a wet field that actually ends up tripping up all of his horses and ends up getting them bogged down in the mud, and Wellington's forces are able to outflank him, right? That's one thing that ends up going down. And also, famously, there is an ABBA song written about the Battle of Waterloo, which is absolutely fantastic. It goes, Waterloo. I know y'all know it, and I'm a terrible singer. That's why I don't do karaoke. But the big thing about it, though, is that the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon's forces lose. He is arrested again, and he is going to end up being exiled yet again, right? And after his second loss to coalition forces in less than 2 years, he was exiled to a new island called St. Helena. And St. Helena is off the coast of Africa, right? Way far away from Europe, right? And he actually ends up dying in 1821, 6 short years later after he loses the Battle of Waterloo. He dies from stomach cancer, all right? So the big thing about it, though, is we'll talk about this a little bit more when I see y'all in class, but we're actually going to have that little short 10-minute flip after this, talking about Congress of Vienna and kind of Europe trying to put itself back together after Napoleon comes in and crushes down everything, right? But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.